discharge himself of these ditties like a weak little broken barrel organ ground by a baby. On his days out, those flecks of light in his flat vista of pollard old men, it was at once Mrs. Plawnish's delight and sorrow, when he was strong with meat and had taken his full halfpennyworth of porter, to say, "Sing us a song, father." Then he would give them Chloe, and if he were in pretty good spirits, Phyllis also. Strephon he had hardly been up to since he went into retirement, and then would Mrs. Plawnish declare that she did believe there never was such a singer as father, and wipe her eyes. If he had come from court on these occasions, nay, if he had been the noble refrigerator come home triumphantly from a foreign court to be presented and promoted on his last tremendous failure, Mrs. Plawnish could not have handed him with greater elevation about Bleeding Heart Yard. "Here's father," she would say, presenting him to a neighbour. "Father will soon be home with us for good now. Ain't father looking well? Father's a sweeter singer than ever. You'd never have forgotten it if you'd have heard him just now." As to Mr. Plawnish, he had married these articles of belief in marrying Mr. Nandy's daughter, and only wondered how it was that so gifted an old gentleman had not made a fortune. This he attributed, after much reflection, to his musical genius not having been scientifically developed in his youth. "For why," argued Mr. Plawnish, "why go a-binding music when you got it in yourself? That's where it is, I consider." Old Nandy had a patron, one patron. He had a patron who, in a certain sumptuous way, an apologetic way, as if he constantly took on admiring audience to witness that he really could not help being more free with this old fellow than they might have expected, on account of his simplicity and poverty, was mightily good to him. Old Nandy had been several times to the Marshalsea College, communicating with his son-in-law during his short durance there, and had happily acquired to himself, and had by degrees and in course of time much improved the patronage of the father of that national institution. Mr. Dorrit was in the habit of receiving this old man as if the old man held of him in vassalage under some feudal tenure. He made little treats and teas for him, as if he came in with his homage from some outlying district where the tenantry were in a primitive state. It seemed as if there were moments when he could by no means have sworn but that the old man was an ancient retainer of his who had been meritoriously faithful. When he mentioned him, he spoke of him casually as his old pensioner. He had a wonderful satisfaction in seeing him and in commenting on his decayed condition after he was gone. It appeared to him amazing that he could hold up his head at all. Poor creature! In the workhouse, sir, the Union, no privacy, no visitors, no station, no respect, no speciality. Most deplorable. It was old Nandy's birthday, and they let him out. He said nothing about its being his birthday, or they might have kept him in, for such old men should not be born. He passed along the streets as usual to Bleeding Heart Yard, and had his dinner with his daughter and son-in-law, and gave them Phyllis. He had hardly concluded when little Dorrit looked in to see how they all were. "Miss Dorrit," said Mrs. Plawnish, "here's father. Ain't he looking nice? And such a voice he's in." Little Dorrit gave him her hand, and smilingly said she had not seen him this long time. "No, they're rather hard on poor father," said Mrs. Plawnish with a lengthening face, "and don't let him have half as much change and fresh air as would benefit him. But he'll soon be home for good now, won't you, father?" "Yes, my dear, I hope so, in good time, please God." Here Mr. Plawnish delivered himself of an oration which he invariably made, word for word the same on all such opportunities. It was couched in the following terms: "John Edward Nandy, sir, while there's an ounce of victuals or drink of any sort in this present roof, you're fully welcome to your share on it. While there's a handful of fire or a mouthful of bed in this present roof, you're fully welcome to your share on it. If so be as there should be nothing in this present roof, you should be as welcome to your share on it as if it was something, much or little. And this is what I mean, and so I don't deceive you, and consequently, which is to stand out, is to entreat you, and therefore why not do it?" To this lucid address, which Mr. Plawnish always delivered as if he had composed it, as no doubt he had, with enormous labour, Mrs. Plawnish's father pipingly replied, I thank you kindly, Thomas, and I know your intentions well, which is the same I thank you kindly for. But no, Thomas, until such times as it's not to take it out of your children's mouths, which take it is, and call it by what name you will do to remain, and equally deprive, though may they come, and too soon they cannot come. No, Thomas, no. Mrs. Plornish, who had been turning her face a little away with a corner of her apron in her hand, brought herself back to the conversation again by telling Miss Dorrit that father was going over the water to pay his respects, unless she knew of any reason why it might not be agreeable. Her answer was, I am going straight home, and if he will come with me I shall be glad to take care of him. So glad, said Little Dorrit, always thoughtful of the feelings of the weak, of his company. There, father, cried Mrs. Plornish, ain't you a gay young man to be going for a walk along with Miss Dorrit? Let me tie your neckerchief into a regular good bow, for you're a regular beau yourself, father, if ever there was one. With this filial joke his daughter smartened him up, and gave him a loving hug, and stood at the door with her weak child in her arms, and her strong child tumbling down the steps, looking after her little old father as he toddled away with his arm under Little Dorrit's. They walked at a slow pace, and Little Dorrit took him by the iron bridge and sat him down there for a rest, and they looked over at the water and talked about the shipping, and the old man mentioned what he would do if he had a ship full of gold coming home to him. His plan was to take a noble lodging for the Plornishes and himself at a tea gardens and live there all the rest of their lives, attended on by the waiter, and it was a special birthday of the old man. They were within 5 minutes of their destination when, at the corner of her own street, they came upon Fanny in her new bonnet bound for the same port. Why, good gracious me, Amy, cried that young lady, starting, you never mean it. Mean what, Fanny dear? Well, I could have believed a great deal of you, returned the young lady with burning indignation, but I don't think even I could have believed this of even you. Fanny, cried Little Dorrit, wounded and astonished. Oh, don't Fanny me, you mean little thing, don't. The idea of coming along the open streets in the broad light of day with a pauper, firing off the last word as if it were a ball from an air gun. Oh, Fanny! I tell you not to Fanny me, for I'll not submit to it. I never knew such a thing. The way in which you are resolved and determined to disgrace us on all occasions is really infamous. You bad little thing. Does it disgrace anybody, said Little Dorrit very gently, to take care of this poor old man? Yes, miss, returned her sister, and you ought to know it does, and you do know it does, and you do it because you know it does. The principal pleasure of your life is to remind your family of their misfortunes, and the next great pleasure of your existence is to keep low company. But however, if you have no sense of decency, I have, you'll please to allow me to go on the other side of the way, unmolested. With this she bounced across to the opposite pavement. The old disgrace, who had been deferentially bowing a pace or two off, for Little Dorrit had let his arm go in her wonder, when Fanny began, and who had been hustled and cursed by impatient passengers for stopping the way, rejoined his companion rather giddy and said, I hope nothing's wrong with your honoured father, miss. I hope there's nothing the matter in the honoured family. No, no, returned Little Dorrit. No, thank you. Give me your arm again, Mr. Nandy. We shall soon be there now. So she talked to him as she had talked before, and they came to the lodge and found Mr. Chivery on the lock and went in. Now it happened that the father of the Marshalsea was sauntering towards the lodge at the moment when they were coming out of it, entering the prison arm in arm. As the spectacle of their approach met his view, he displayed the utmost agitation and despondency of mind, and altogether regardless of old Nandy, who, making his reverence, stood with his hat in his hand, as he always did in that gracious presence, turned about and hurried in at his own doorway and up the staircase. Leaving the old unfortunate, whom in an evil hour she had taken under her protection, with a hurried promise to return to him directly, Little Dorrit hastened after her father, and on the staircase found Fanny following her, and flouncing up with offended dignity. The three came into the room almost together, and the father sat down in his chair, buried his face in his hands, and uttered a groan. "Of course," said Fanny. "Very proper. Poor afflicted pa. Now I hope you believe me, miss." "What is it, father?" cried Little Dorrit, bending over him. "Have I made you unhappy, father?" "Not I hope." "You hope indeed, I dare say. Oh, you!" Fanny paused for a sufficiently strong expression. "You common-minded little Amy. You complete prison child." He stopped these angry reproaches with a wave of his hand and sobbed out, raising his face and shaking his melancholy head at his younger daughter. "Amy, I know that you are innocent in intention, but you have cut me to the soul." "Innocent in intention?" the implacable Fanny struck in. "Stuff in intention, low in intention, lowering of the family in intention." "Father," cried Little Dorrit, pale and trembling, "I am very sorry. Pray forgive me. Tell me how it is that I may not do it again." "How it is, you prevaricating little piece of goods?" cried Fanny. "You know how it is. I have told you already, so don't fly in the face of Providence by attempting to deny it." "Hush, Amy," said the father, passing his pocket-handkerchief several times across his face, and then grasping it convulsively in the hand that dropped across his knee. "I have done what I could to keep you select here. I have done what I could to retain you a position here. I may have succeeded, I may not. You may know it, you may not. I give no opinion. I have endured everything here but humiliation. That I have happily been spared, until this day." Here his convulsive grasp unclosed itself, and he put his pocket-handkerchief to his eyes again. Little Dorrit, on the ground beside him, with her imploring hand upon his arm, watched him remorsefully. Coming out of his fit of grief, he clenched his pocket-handkerchief once more. "Humiliation I have happily been spared until this day. Through all my troubles there has been that spirit in myself, and that submission to it, if I may use the term, in those about me, which has spared me humiliation. But this day, this minute, I have keenly felt it." "Of course. How could it be otherwise?" exclaimed the irrepressible Fanny, careering and prancing about with a pauper air-gun again. "But, dear father," cried Little Dorrit, "I don't justify myself for having wounded your dear heart. No, heaven knows I don't." She clasped her hands in quite an agony of distress. "I do nothing but beg and pray you to be comforted and overlook it. But if I had not known that you were kind to the old man yourself, and took much notice of him, and were always glad to see him, I would not have come here with him, father. I would not, indeed. What I have been so unhappy as to do, I have done in mistake. I would not wilfully bring a tear to your eyes, dear love," said Little Dorrit, her heart well nigh broken, "for anything the world could give me, or anything it could take away." Fanny, with a partly angry and partly repentant sob, began to cry herself, and to say, as this young lady always said when she was half in passion and half out of it, half spiteful with herself and half spiteful with everybody else, that she wished she were dead. The father of the Marshalsea in the meantime took his younger daughter to his breast and patted her head. "There, there, say no more, Amy, say no more, my child. I will forget it as soon as I can. With hysterical cheerfulness, "I shall soon be able to dismiss it. It is perfectly true, my dear, that I am always glad to see my old pensioner as such, and that I do extend as much protection and kindness to the bruised reed, I trust I may so call him without impropriety, as in my circumstances I can. It is quite true that this is the case, my dear child. At the same time, I preserve in doing this, if I may use the expression, spirit, becoming spirit. And there are some things which are—" he stopped to sob, "irreconcilable with that, and wound it deeply. It is not that I have seen my good Amy attentive and condescending to my old pensioner. It is not that hurts me. It is, if I am to close the painful subject by being explicit, that I have seen my child, my own daughter, coming into this college out of the public streets, smiling, arm in arm with, oh my God, a livery." This reference to the coat of no cut and no time the unfortunate gentleman gasped forth in a scarcely audible voice, and with his clenched pocket-handkerchief raised in the air. His excited feelings might have found some further painful utterance, but for a knock at the door, which had been already twice repeated, and to which Fanny, still wishing herself dead, and indeed now going so far as to add buried, cried, "Come in." "Ah, young John," said the father, in an altered and calmed voice. "What is it, young John?" "A letter for you, sir, being left in the lodge just this minute, and a message with it. I thought, happening to be there myself, sir, I would bring it to your room." The speaker's attention was much distracted by the piteous spectacle of little Dorrit at her father's feet, with her head turned away. "Indeed, John. Thank you." "The letter is from Mr. Clennam, sir. It's the answer, and the message was, sir, that Mr. Clennam also sent his compliments, and word that he would do himself the pleasure of calling this afternoon, hoping to see you, and likewise," attention more distracted than before, "Miss Amy." "Oh." As the father glanced into the letter, there was a banknote in it. He reddened a little, and patted Amy on the head afresh. "Thank you, young John. Quite right. Much obliged to you for your attention. No one waiting?" "No, sir. No one waiting." "Thank you, John. How is your mother, young John?" "Thank you, sir. She's not quite as well as we could wish. In fact, we none of us are, except father. But she's pretty well, sir. Say we sent our remembrances, will you? Say kind remembrances, if you please, young John." "Thank you, sir, I will." And Mr. Chivery Junior went his way, having spontaneously composed on the spot an entirely new epitaph for himself, to the effect that here lay the body of John Chivery, who, having at such a date beheld the idol of his life in grief and tears, and feeling unable to bear the harrowing spectacle, immediately repaired to the abode of his inconsolable parents, and terminated his existence by his own rash act. "There, Amy," said the father, when young John had closed the door. "Let us say no more about it." The last few minutes had improved his spirits remarkably, and he was quite lightsome. "Where is my old pensioner all this while? We must not leave him by himself any longer, or he will begin to suppose he is not welcome, and that would pain me. Will you fetch him, my child, or shall I?" "If you wouldn't mind, father," said little Dorrit, trying to bring her sobbing to a close. "Certainly, I will go, my dear. I forgot, your eyes are rather red. There, cheer up, Amy. Don't be uneasy about me. I am quite myself again, my love, quite myself. Go to your room, Amy, and make yourself look comfortable and pleasant to receive Mr. Clennam." "I would rather stay in my own room, father," returned little Dorrit, finding it more difficult than before to regain her composure. "I would far rather not see Mr. Clennam." "Oh, fie, my dear, that's folly. Mr. Clennam is a very gentlemanly gentleman, very gentlemanly, a little reserved at times, but I will say extremely gentlemanly. I couldn't think of your not being here to receive Mr. Clennam, my dear, especially this afternoon. So go and freshen yourself up, Amy. Go and freshen yourself up like a good girl." Thus directed, little Dorrit dutifully rose and obeyed, only pausing for a moment as she went out of the room to give her sister a kiss of reconciliation. Upon which, that young lady, feeling much harassed in her mind, and having for the time worn out the wish with which she generally relieved it, conceived and executed the brilliant idea of wishing old Nandy dead, rather than that he should come bothering there like a disgusting, tiresome, wicked wretch, and making mischief between two sisters. The father of the Marshalsea, even humming a tune, and wearing his black velvet cap a little on one side, so much improved were his spirits, went down into the yard, and found his old pensioner standing there, hat in hand, just within the gate, as he had stood all this time. "Come, Nandy," said he, with great suavity. "Come upstairs, Nandy. You know the way. Why don't you come upstairs?" He went the length on this occasion of giving him his hand and saying, "How are you, Nandy? Are you pretty well?" To which the vocalist returned, "I thank you, honoured sir. I am all the better for seeing your honour." As they went along the yard, the father of the Marshalsea presented him to a collegian of recent date. "An old acquaintance of mine, sir, an old pensioner." and then said, "Be covered, my good Nandy, put your hat on," with great consideration. His patronage did not stop here, for he charged Maggie to get the tea ready, and instructed her to buy certain tea cakes, fresh butter, eggs, cold ham, and shrimps, to purchase which collation he gave her a banknote for £10, laying strict injunctions on her to be careful of the change. These preparations were in an advanced stage of progress, and his daughter Amy had come back with her work, when Clennam presented himself, whom he most graciously received, and besought to join their meal. "Amy, my love, you know Mr. Clennam even better than I have the happiness of doing. Fanny, my dear, you are acquainted with Mr. Clennam?" Fanny acknowledged him haughtily, the position she tacitly took up in all such cases being that there was a vast conspiracy to insult the family by not understanding it, or sufficiently deferring to it, and here was one of the conspirators. "This, Mr. Clennam, you must know, is an old pensioner of mine, old Nandy, a very faithful old man." He always spoke of him as an object of great antiquity, but he was 2 or 3 years younger than himself. "Let me see. You know Plornish, I think. I think my daughter Amy has mentioned to me that you know poor Plornish." "Oh, yes," said Arthur Clennam. "Well, sir, this is Mrs. Plornish's father." "Indeed. I am glad to see him." "You would be more glad if you knew his many good qualities, Mr. Clennam." "I hope I shall come to know them through knowing him," said Arthur, secretly pitying the bowed and submissive figure. "It is a holiday with him, and he comes to see his old friends, who are always glad to see him," observed the father of the Marshalsea. Then he added behind his hand, "Union, poor old fellow, out for the day." By this time, Maggie, quietly assisted by her little mother, had spread the board, and the repast was ready. It being hot weather, and the prison very close, the window was as wide open as it could be pushed. "If Maggie will spread the newspaper on the window-sill, my dear," remarked the father complacently in a half-whisper to little Dorrit, "my old pensioner can have his tea there while we are having ours." So, with a gulf between him and the good company of about a foot in width, standard measure, Mrs. Plornish's father was handsomely regaled. Clennam had never seen anything like his magnanimous protection by that other father, he of the Marshalsea, and was lost in the contemplation of its many wonders. The most striking of these was perhaps the relishing manner in which he remarked on the pensioner's infirmities and failings, as if he were a gracious keeper making a running commentary on the decline of the harmless animal he exhibited. "Not ready for ham yet, Nandy? Why, how slow you are! His last teeth," he explained to the company, "are going, poor old boy." At another time he said, "No shrimps, Nandy?" and on his not instantly replying observed, "His hearing is becoming very defective. He'll be deaf directly." At another time he asked him, "Do you walk much, Nandy, about the yard within the walls of that place of yours?" "No, sir. No, I haven't any great liking for that." "No, to be sure," he assented. "Very natural." Then he privately informed the circle, "Legs going." Once he asked the pensioner, in that general clemency which asked him anything to keep him afloat, how old his younger grandchild was. "John Edward," said the pensioner, slowly laying down his knife and fork to consider. "How old, sir? Let me think now." Father of the Marshalsea tapped his forehead. "Memory weak." "John Edward, sir? Well, I really forgot. I couldn't say at this minute, sir, whether it's 2 and 2 months or whether it's 2 and 5 months. It's one or the other." "Don't distress yourself by worrying your mind about it," he returned, with infinite forbearance. "Faculty is evidently decaying. Old man rusts in the life he leads." The more of these discoveries that he persuaded himself he made in the pensioner, the better he appeared to like him, and when he got out of his chair after tea to bid the pensioner good-bye, on his intimating that he feared, honoured sir, his time was running out, he made himself look as erect and strong as possible. "We don't call this a shilling, Nandy, you know," he said, putting one in his hand. "We call it tobacco." "Honoured sir, I thank you. I shall buy tobacco. My thanks and duty to Miss Amy and Miss Fanny. I wish you good night, Mr. Clennam. And mind you don't forget us, you know, Nandy, said the father. You must come again, mind, whenever you have an afternoon. You must not come out without seeing us, or we shall be jealous. Good night, Nandy. Be very careful how you descend the stairs, Nandy. They are rather uneven and worn. With that, he stood on the landing, watching the old man down, and when he came into the room again, said, with a solemn satisfaction on him, A melancholy sight, that, Mr. Clennam, though one has the consolation of knowing that he doesn't feel it himself. The poor old fellow is a dismal wreck, spirit broken and gone, pulverized, crushed out of him, sir, completely. As Clennam had a purpose in remaining, he said what he could responsive to these sentiments, and stood at the window with their enunciator, while Maggie and her little mother washed the tea service and cleared it away. He noticed that his companions stood at the window with the air of an affable and accessible sovereign, and that, when any of his people in the yard below looked up, his recognition of their salutes just stopped short of a blessing. When little Dorrit had her work on the table and Maggie hers on the bedstead, Fanny fell to tying her bonnet as a preliminary to her departure. Arthur, still having his purpose, still remained. At this time the door opened without any notice, and Mr. Tipp came in. He kissed Amy as she started up to meet him, nodded to Fanny, nodded to his father, gloomed on the visitor without further recognition, and sat down. "Tipp, dear," said little Dorrit, mildly shocked by this, "don't you see—" "Yes, I see, Amy. If you refer to the presence of any visitor you have here, I say, if you refer to that," answered Tipp, jerking his head with emphasis towards his shoulder nearest Clennam. "I see." "Is that all you say?" "That's all I say, and I suppose," added the lofty young man, after a moment's pause, "that visitor will understand me when I say that's all I say. In short, I suppose the visitor will understand that he hasn't used me like a gentleman." "I do not understand that," observed the obnoxious personage referred to, with tranquillity. "No? Why, then, to make it clearer to you, sir, I beg you to let you know that when I address what I call a properly worded appeal, and an urgent appeal, and a delicate appeal, to an individual for a small temporary accommodation easily within his power, mind, and when that individual writes back word to me that he begs to be excused, I consider that he doesn't treat me like a gentleman." The father of the Marshalsea, who had surveyed his son in silence, no sooner heard this sentiment than he began in angry voice, "How dare you?" But his son stopped him. "Now, don't ask me how I dare, father, because that's bosh. As to the fact of the line of conduct I choose to adopt towards the individual present, you ought to be proud of my showing a proper spirit." "I should think so," cried Fanny. "A proper spirit?" said the father. "Yes, a proper spirit, a becoming spirit." "Is it come to this, that my son teaches me, spirit? Now, don't let us bother about it, father, or have any row on the subject. I have fully made up my mind that the individual present has not treated me like a gentleman, and there's an end of it." "But there is not an end of it, sir," returned the father. "But there shall be an end of it. You have made up your mind? You have made up your mind?" "Yes, I have. What's the good of keeping on like that?" "Because," returned the father in a great heat, "you had no right to make up your mind to what is monstrous, to what is immoral, what is parricidal. No, Mr. Clennam, I beg, sir, don't ask me to desist. There is a general principle involved here which rises even above considerations of hospitality. I object to the assertion made by my son. I personally repel it." "Why, what is it to you, father?" returned the son over his shoulder. "What is it to me, sir? I have a spirit, sir, that will not endure it. He took out his pocket-handkerchief again and dabbed his face. "I am outraged and insulted by it. Let me suppose the case that I myself may at a certain times have made an appeal, and a properly worded appeal, and a delicate appeal, and an urgent appeal to some individual for a small temporary accommodation. let me suppose that accommodation could have been easily extended and was not extended, and that individual informed me that he begged to be excused. Am I to be told by my own son that I therefore received treatment not due to a gentleman, and that I submitted to it?" His daughter Amy gently tried to calm him, but he would not on any account be calmed. He said his spirit was up and wouldn't endure this. Was he to be told that he wished to know again by his own son on his own hearth to his own face? Was that humiliation to be put upon him by his own blood? "You are putting it on yourself, father, and getting into all this injury of your own accord," said the young gentleman morosely. "What I have made up my mind about has nothing to do with you. What I said had nothing to do with you. Why need you go trying on other people's hats?" "I reply it has everything to do with me," returned the father. "I point out to you, sir, with indignation that the delicacy and peculiarity of your father's position should strike you dumb, sir, if nothing else should, in laying down such unnatural principles. Besides, if you are not filial, sir, if you discard that duty, you are at least not a Christian. Are you an atheist? And is it Christian, let me ask you, to stigmatize and denounce an individual for begging to be excused this time, when the same individual may respond with the required accommodation next time? Is it the part of a Christian not to try him again?" He had worked himself into quite a religious glow and fervour. "I see precious well," said Mr. Tipp, rising, "that I shall get no sensible or fair argument here tonight, and so the best thing I can do is to cut. Good night, Amy. Don't be vexed. I am very sorry it happens here, and you here. Upon my soul I am, but I can't altogether part with my spirit, even for your sake, old girl." With those words he put on his hat and went out, accompanied by Miss Fanny, who did not consider it spirited on her part to take leave of Clennam with any less supposing demonstration than a stare, importing that she had always known him for one of the large body of conspirators. When they were gone, the father of the Marshalsea was at first inclined to sink into despondency again, and would have done so, but that a gentleman opportunity came up within a minute or two to attend him to the snuggery. It was the gentleman Clement had seen on the night of his own accidental detention there, who had that impalpable grievance about the misappropriated fund on which the Marshal was supposed to batten. He presented himself as deputation to escort the father to the chair, it being an occasion on which he had promised to preside over the assembled collegians in the enjoyment of a little harmony. "Such as you see, Mr. Clennam," said the father, "are the incongruities of my position here. But a public duty? No man, I am sure, would more readily recognize a public duty than yourself." Clennam besought him not to delay a moment. "Amy, my dear, if you can persuade Mr. Clennam to stay longer, I can leave the honours of our poor apology for an establishment with confidence in your hands, and perhaps you may do something towards erasing from Mr. Clennam's mind the untoward and unpleasant circumstances which has occurred since tea-time." Clennam assured him that it made no impression on his mind, and therefore required no erasure. "My dear sir," said the father, with a removal of his black cap and a grasp of Clement's hand, combining to express the safe receipt of his note and enclosure that afternoon, "Heaven bless you." So, at last, Clennam's purpose in remaining was attained, and he could speak to little Dorrit with nobody by. Maggie counted as nobody, and she was by. Chapter 32. More Fortune-Telling. Maggie sat at her work in her great white cap, with its quantity of opaque frilling hiding what profile she had none to spare, and her serviceable eye brought to bear upon her occupation on the window side of the room. What with her flapping cap, and what with her unserviceable eye, she was quite partitioned off from her little mother, whose seat was opposite the window. The tread and shuffle of feet on the pavement of the yard had much diminished since the taking of the chair, the tide of collegians having set strongly in the direction of harmony. Some few who had no music in their souls or no money in their pockets dawdled about, and the old spectacle of the visitor wife and the depressed, unseasoned prisoner still lingered in corners as broken cobwebs and such unsightly discomforts draggled in corners of other places. It was the quietest time, the college knew, saving the night hours when the collegians took the benefit of the act of sleep. The occasional rattle of applause upon the tables of the snuggery denoted the successful termination of a morsel of harmony, or the responsive acceptance of the united children of some toast or sentiment offered to them by their father. Occasionally, a vocal strain of more sonorous than the generality informed the listener that some boastful bass was in blue water, or in the hunting field, or with the reindeer, or on the mountain, or among the heather. But the Marshal of the Marshalsea knew better, and had got him hard and fast. As Arthur Clennam moved to sit down by the side of little Dorrit, she trembled so that she had much ado to hold her needle. Clennam gently put his hand upon her work and said, "Dear little Dorrit, let me lay it down." She yielded it to him, and he put it aside. Her hands were then nervously clasping together, but he took one of them. "How seldom I have seen you lately, little Dorrit." "I have been busy, sir." "But I heard only today," said Clennam, "by mere accident, of your having been with those good people close by. Why not come to me, then?" I don't know. Or rather, I thought you might be busy too. You generally are now, are you not?" He saw her trembling little form and her downcast face, and the eyes that drooped the moment they were raised to his. He saw them almost with as much concern as tenderness. "My child, your manner is so changed." The trembling was now quite beyond her control. Softly withdrawing her hand and laying it in her other hand, she sat before him with her head bent and her whole form trembling. "My own little Dorrit," said Clennam compassionately. She burst into tears. Maggie looked round of a sudden and stared for at least a minute, but did not interpose. Clennam waited some little while before he spoke again. "I cannot bear," he said then, "to see you weep, but I hope this is a relief to an overcharged heart." "Yes, it is, sir. Nothing but that." "Well, well, I feared you would think too much of what passed here just now. It is of no moment, not the least. I am only unfortunate to have come in the way. Let it go by with these tears. It is not worth one of them. One of them? Such an idle thing should be repeated with my glad consent 50 times a day to save you a moment's heartache, little Dorrit." She had taken courage now, and answered far more in her usual manner. "You are so good, but even if there was nothing else in it to be sorry for and ashamed of, it is such a bad return to you." "Hush," said Clennam, smiling and touching her lips with his hand. "Forgetfulness in you, who remember so many and so much, would be new indeed. Shall I remind you that I am not, and that I never was, anything but the friend whom you agreed to trust? No. You remember it, don't you?" "I try to do so, or I should have broken the promise just now when my mistaken brother was here. You will consider his bringing up in this place, and will not judge him hardly, poor fellow, I know." In raising her eyes with these words, she observed his face more nearly than she had done yet, and said with a quick change of tone, "You have not been ill, Mr. Clennam?" "No." "Nor tried, nor hurt?" she asked him anxiously. It fell to Clennam now to be not quite certain how to answer. He said in reply, "To speak the truth, I have been a little troubled, but it is over. Do I show it so plainly? I ought to have more fortitude and self-command than that. I thought I had. I must learn them of you. You could teach me better." He never thought that she saw in him what no one else could see. He never thought that in the whole world there were no other eyes that looked upon him with the same light and strength as hers. "But it brings to me something that I wish to say," he continued. and therefore I will not quarrel even with my own face for telling tales and being unfaithful to me. Besides, it is a privilege and a pleasure to confide in my little Dorrit. Let me confess, then, that, forgetting how grave I was, and how old I was, and how the time for such things had gone by me, with the many years of sameness and little happiness that made up my long life far away, without marking it, that, forgetting all this, I fancied I loved someone. "Do I know her, sir?" asked little Dorrit. "No, my child. Not the lady who has been kind to me for your sake. Flora, no. Do you think—" "I never quite thought so," said little Dorrit, "more to herself than him. I did wonder at it a little." "Well," said Clennam, abiding by the feeling that had fallen on him in the avenue on the night of the roses, the feeling that he was an older man who had done with that tender part of life, "I found out my mistake, and I thought about it a little, in short a good deal, and got wiser. Being wiser, I counted up my years and considered what I am, and looked back and looked forward, and found that I should soon be grey. I found that I had climbed the hill and passed the level ground upon the top, and was descending quickly. If he had known the sharpness of the pain he caused the patient heart in speaking thus, while doing it too with the purpose of easing and serving her, I found that the day when any such thing would have been graceful in me, or good in me, or hopeful or happy for me, or any one in connection with me, was gone, and would never shine again. Oh, if he had known, if he had known! If he could have seen the dagger in his hand and the cruel wounds it struck in the faithful, bleeding breast of his little Dorrit. All that is over, and I have turned my face from it. Why do I speak of this to little Dorrit? Why do I show you, my child, the space of years that there is between us, and recall to you that I have passed by the amount of your whole life, the time that is present to you? Because you trust me, I hope. Because you know that nothing can touch you without touching me, that nothing can make you happy or unhappy, but it must make me, who am so grateful to you, the same." He heard the thrill in her voice, he saw her earnest face, he saw her clear, true eyes, he saw the quickened bosom that would have joyfully thrown itself before him to receive a mortal wound directed at his breast, with the dying cry, "I love him," and the remotest suspicion of the truth never dawned upon his mind. No, he saw the devoted little creature with her worn shoes, in her common dress, in her jail home, a slender child in body, a strong heroine in soul, and the light of her domestic story made all else dark to him. For those reasons, assuredly, little Dorrit, but for another too, so far removed, so different, and so much older, I am the better fitted for your friend and adviser. I mean, I am the more easily to be trusted, and any little constraint that you might feel with another may vanish before me. Why have you kept so retired from me? Tell me. I am better here. My place and use are here. I am much better here, said little Dorrit faintly. So you said that day upon the bridge. I thought of it much afterwards. Have you no secret you could entrust to me with hope and comfort if you would? Secret? No, I have no secret, said little Dorrit in some trouble. They had been speaking in low voices, more because it was natural what they said to adopt that tone than with any care to reserve it from Maggie at her work. All of a sudden Maggie stared again, and this time spoke. "I say, little mother—" "Yes, Maggie?" "If you ain't got no secret of your own to tell him about the princess. She had a secret, you know." "The princess had a secret?" said Clennam in some surprise. "What princess was that, Maggie?" "Law, how you do go and bother a gal of 10, said Maggie, "catching the poor thing up in that way. Whoever said the princess had a secret? I never said so." "I beg your pardon, I thought you did." "No, I didn't. How could I, when it was her as wanted to find it out? It was the little woman as had the secret, and she was always a-spinning at her wheel. And so she says to her, 'Why do you keep it there?' And so the t'other one says to her, 'No, I don't.' And so the t'other one says to her, 'Yes, you do.' And then they both goes to the cupboard, and there it is. And she wouldn't go into the hospital, and so she died. You know, little mother, tell him that. For it was a regular good secret, that was," cried Maggie, hugging herself. Arthur looked at little Dorrit for help to comprehend this, and was struck by seeing her so timid and red. But when she told him that it was only a fairy tale she had one day made up for Maggie, and that there was nothing in it which she wouldn't be ashamed to tell again to anybody else, even if she could remember it, he left the subject where it was. However, he returned to his own subject by first entreating her to see him oftener, and to remember that it was impossible to have a stronger interest in her welfare than he had, or to be more set upon promoting it than he was. When she answered fervently, she well knew that she never forgot it, he touched upon his second and more delicate point, the suspicion he had formed. "Little Dorrit," he said, taking her hand again and speaking lower than he had spoken yet, so that even Maggie in the small room could not hear him. "Another word. I have wanted very much to say this to you. I have tried for opportunities. Don't mind me, who, for the matter of years, might be your father or your uncle. Always think of me as quite an old man. I know that all your devotion centres in this room, and that nothing to the last will ever tempt you away from the duties you discharge here. If I were not so sure of it, I should before now have implored you, and implored your father, to let me make some provision for you in a more suitable place. But you may have an interest, I will not say now, though even that may have at another time an interest in someone else, an interest not incompatible with your affection here." She was very, very pale, and silently shook her head. "It may be, dear little Dorrit." "No, no, no." She shook her head, after each slow repetition of the word, with an air of quiet desolation that he remembered long afterwards. The time came when he remembered it well, long afterwards, within those prison walls, within that very room. "But if it ever should be, tell me so, my dear child. Entrust the truth to me, point out the object of such an interest to me, and I will try with all the zeal and honour and friendship and respect that I feel for you, good little Dorrit of my heart, to do you a lasting service." "Oh, thank you, thank you. But oh no, oh no, oh no." She said this, looking at him with her work-worn hands folded together, and in the same resigned accents as before. "I press for no confidence now. I only ask you to repose unhesitating trust in me." "Can I do less than that, when you are so good?" "Then you will trust me fully, will have no secret unhappiness or anxiety concealed from me?" "Almost none." "And you have none now?" She shook her head, but she was very pale. "When I lie down tonight and my thoughts come back, as they will, for they do every night, even when I have not seen you, to this sad place, I may believe that there is no grief beyond this room now and its usual occupants, which preys on little Dorrit's mind?" She seemed to catch at these words that he remembered too long afterwards, and said more brightly, "Yes, Mr. Clennam, yes, you may." The crazy staircase, usually not slow to give notice when anyone was coming up or down, here creaked under a quick tread, and a further sound was heard upon it, as if a little steam engine with more steam than it knew what to do with were working towards the room. As it approached, which it did very rapidly, it laboured and increased energy, and after knocking at the door it sounded as if it were stooping down and snorting in at the keyhole. Before Maggie could open the door, Mr. Panks, opening it from without, stood without a hat and with his bare head in the wildest condition, looking at Clennam and little Dorrit over her shoulder. He had a lighted cigar in his hand and brought with him airs of ale and tobacco smoke. "Panks the gypsy," he observed out of breath, "fortune-telling." He stood, dingily smiling and breathing hard at them, with a most curious air, as if, instead of being his proprietor's grubber, he were the triumphant proprietor of the Marshalsea, the Marshal, all the turnkeys, and all the collegians. In his great self-satisfaction he put his cigar to his lips, being evidently no smoker, and took such a pull at it, with his right eye shut up tight for the purpose, that he underwent a convulsion of shuddering and choking. But even in the midst of that paroxysm, he still essayed to repeat his favourite introduction of himself, "Panks, the gypsy, fortune-telling." "I am spending the evening with the rest of 'em," said Panks. "I've been singing. I've been taking a part in White Sand and Grey Sand. I don't know anything about it. Never mind, I'll take any part in anything. It's all the same if you're loud enough." At first Clennam supposed him to be intoxicated, but he soon perceived that though he might be a little the worse or better for ale, the staple of his excitement was not brewed from malt or distilled from any grain or berry. "How do you do, Miss Dorrit?" said Panks. "I thought you wouldn't mind my running round and looking in for a moment. Mr. Clennam, I heard, was here from Mr. Dorrit. How are you, sir?" Clennam thanked him and said he was glad to see him so gay. "Gay?" said Panks. "I am in wonderful feather, sir. I can't stop a minute or I shall be missed, and I don't want 'em to miss me. Eh, Miss Dorrit?" He seemed to have an insatiate delight in appealing to her and looking at her, excitedly sticking his hair up at the same moment, like a dark species of cockatoo. "I haven't been here half an hour. I knew Mr. Dorrit was in the chair, and I said, I'll go and support him. I ought to be down in Bleeding Heart Yard by rights, but I can worry them tomorrow. Eh, Miss Dorrit?" His little black eyes sparkled electrically. His very hair seemed to sparkle as he roughened it. He was in that highly charged state that one might have expected to draw sparks and snaps from him by presenting a knuckle to any part of his figure. "Capital company here," said Panks. "Eh, Miss Dorrit?" She was half afraid of him and irresolute what to say. He laughed with a nod towards Clennam. "Don't mind him, Miss Dorrit. He's one of us. We agreed that you shouldn't take on to mind me before people, but we didn't mean Mr. Clennam. He's one of us. He's in it, aren't you, Clennam? Eh, Miss Dorrit?" The excitement of this strange creature was fast communing itself to Clennam. Little Dorrit, with amazement, saw this and observed that they exchanged quick looks. "I was making a remark," said Panks. "Before I declare I forget what it was. Oh, I know, capital company here. I've been treating 'em all round. Eh, Miss Dorrit?" "Very generous of you," she returned, noticing another of the quick looks between the two. "Not at all," said Panks. "Don't mention it. I'm coming into my property, that's the fact. I can afford to be liberal. I think I'll give 'em a treat here. Tables laid in the yard, bread in stacks, pipes in faggots, tobacco in hayloads, roast beef and plum pudding for everyone. Quart of double stout ahead, pint of wine too if they like it and the authorities give permission. Eh, Miss Dorrit?" She was thrown into such a confusion by his manner, or rather by Clennam's growing understanding of his manner, for she looked to him after every fresh appeal and cockatoo demonstration on the part of Mr. Panks, that she only moved her lips in answer without forming any word. "Oh, by the by," said Panks, "you were to live to know what was behind us on that little hand of yours, and so you shall, my darling. Eh, Miss Dorrit?" He had suddenly checked himself. Where he got all the additional black prongs from, that now flew up all over his head like the myriads of points that break out in the large change of a great firework, was a wonderful mystery. "But I shall be missed." He came back to that. "And I don't want 'em to miss me, Mr. Clennam. You and I made a bargain. I said you should find me stick to it. You shall find me stick to it now, sir, if you'll step out of the room a moment. Miss Dorrit, I wish you good night. Miss Dorrit, I wish you good fortune." He rapidly shook her by both hands and puffed downstairs. Arthur followed him with such a hurried step that he had very nearly tumbled over him on the last landing and rolled him down into the yard. "What is it, for heaven's sake?" Arthur demanded when they burst out there both together. "Stop a moment, sir. Mr. Rugg. Let me introduce him." With those words he presented another man without a hat, and also with a cigar, and also surrounded with a halo of ale and tobacco smoke, which man, though not so excited as himself, was in a state which would have been akin to lunacy but for its fading into sober method when compared with the rampancy of Mr. Panks. "Mr. Clennam, Mr. Rugg," said Panks. "Stop a moment. Come to the pump." They adjourned to the pump. Mr. Panks, instantly putting his head under the spout, requested Mr. Rugg to take a good strong turn at the handle. Mr. Rugg complying to the letter, Mr. Panks came forth snorting and blowing to some purpose, and dried himself on his handkerchief. "I am clearer for that," he gasped to Clennam, standing astonished. "But upon my soul, to hear her father making speeches in that chair, knowing what we know, and to see her up in that room in that dress, knowing what we know, is enough to— Give me a back, Mr. Rugg. A little higher, sir. That'll do." Then and there, on that Marshalsea pavement, in the shades of evening, did Mr. Panks, of all mankind, fly over the head and shoulders of Mr. Rugg of Pentonville, general agent, accountant, and recoverer of debts. Alighting on his feet, he took Clennam by the buttonhole, led him behind the pump, and pantingly produced from his pocket a bundle of papers. Mr. Rugg also pantingly produced from his pocket a bundle of papers. "Stay," said Clennam in a whisper. "You have made a discovery." Mr. Panks answered, with an unction which there is no language to convey, "We rather think so." "Does it implicate anyone?" "How implicate, sir?" "In any suppression or wrong-dealing of any kind?" "Not a bit of it." "Thank God," said Clennam to himself. "Now show me." "You are to understand," snorted Panks, feverishly unfolding papers and speaking in short, high-pressure blasts of sentences. "Where's the pedigree? Where's Schedule number 4, Mr. Rugg? Oh, all right. Here we are. You understand that we are this very day virtually complete. We shan't be legally for a day or two. Call it at the outside a week. We've been at it night and day for I don't know how long. Mr. Rugg, you know how long? Never mind. Don't say. You'll only confuse me. You shall tell her, Mr. Clennam. Not till we give you leave. Where's that rough total, Mr. Rugg? Oh, here we are. There, sir. That's what you'll have to break to her. That man's your father of the Marshalsea." Chapter 33. Mrs. Merdle's Complaint. Resigning herself to inevitable fate by making the best of those people, the Miggleses, and submitting her philosophy to the draft upon it, of which she had foreseen the likelihood in her interview with Arthur, Mrs. Gowan handsomely resolved not to oppose her son's marriage. In her progress to, and happy arrival at, this resolution, she was possibly influenced not only by her maternal affections, but by 3 politic considerations. Of these, the first may have been that her son had never signified the smallest intention to ask her consent, or any mistrust of his ability to dispense with it. The second, that the pension bestowed upon her by a grateful country and a barnacle would be freed from any little filial inroads when her Henry should be married to the darling only child of a man in very easy circumstances. The third, that Henry's debts must clearly be paid down upon the altar railing by his father-in-law. When, to these 3-fold points of prudence, there is added the fact that Mrs. Gowan yielded her consent the moment she knew of Mr. Meagles having yielded his, and that Mr. Meagles's objection to the marriage had been the sole obstacle in its way all along, it becomes the height of probability that the relict of the deceased commissioner of nothing particular turned these ideas in her sagacious mind. Among her connections and acquaintances, however, she maintained her individual dignity and the dignity of the blood of the Barnacles by diligently nursing the pretence that it was a most unfortunate business, that she was sadly cut up by it, that this was a perfect fascination under which Henry laboured, that she had opposed it for a long time, but what could a mother do, and the like. She had already called Arthur Clennam to bear witness to this fable as a friend of the Meagles family, and she followed up the move by now impounding the family itself for the same purpose. In the first interview she accorded to Mr. Meagles, she slided herself into the position of disconsolately but gracefully yielding to irresistible pressure. With the utmost politeness and good breeding, she feigned that it was she, not he, who had made the difficulty, and who at length gave way, and that the sacrifice was hers, not his. The same feint, with the same polite dexterity, she foisted on Mrs. Meagles, as a conjurer might have forced a card on that innocent lady, and when her future daughter-in-law was presented to her by her son, she said on embracing her, "My dear, what have you done to Henry that has bewitched him so?" At the same time allowing a few tears to carry before him, in little pills, the cosmetic powder on her nose, as a delicate but touching signal that she suffered much inwardly for the show of composure with which she bore her misfortune. Among the friends of Mrs. Gowan, who piqued herself at once on being society and on maintaining intimate and easy relations with that power, Mrs. Merdle occupied a front row. True, the Hampton Court bohemians, without exception, turned up their noses at Merdle as an upstart, but they turned them down again by falling flat on their faces to worship his wealth. In which compensating adjustment of their noses, they were pretty much like Treasury, Bar, and Bishop, and all the rest of them. To Mrs. Merdle, Mrs. Gowan repaired on a visit of self-condolence after having given the gracious consent aforesaid. She drove into town for the purpose in a one-horse carriage irreverently called at that period of English history a pillbox. It belonged to a job-master in a small way, who drove it himself and who jobbed at it by the day or hour to most of the old ladies in Hampton Court Palace, but it was a point of ceremony in that encampment that the whole equipage should be tacitly regarded as the private property of the jobber for the time being, and that the job-master should betray personal knowledge of nobody but the jobber in possession. So the circumlocution barnacles, who were the largest job-masters in the universe, always pretended to know of no other job but the job immediately in hand. Mrs. Merdle was at home, and was in her nest of crimson and gold, with the parrot on a neighbouring stem watching her with his head on one side, as if he took her for another splendid parrot of a larger species, to whom entered Mrs. Gowan with her favourite green fan, which softened the light on the spots of bloom. "My dear soul," tapping the back of her friend's hand with this fan after a little indifferent conversation, "you are my only comfort. That affair of Henry's that I told you of is to take place. Now, how does it strike you? I am dying to know, because you represent and express society so well." Mrs. Merdle reviewed the bosom which society was accustomed to review, and having ascertained that show window of Mr. Merdle's and the London jewellers to be in good order, replied, "As to marriage on the part of a man, my dear, society requires that he should retrieve his fortunes by marriage. Society requires that he should gain by marriage. Society requires that he should found a handsome establishment by marriage. Society does not see otherwise what he has to do with marriage." "Bird, be quiet." For the parrot on his cage above them, presiding over the conference as if he were a judge, and indeed he looked rather like one, had wound up the exposition with a shriek. "Cases there are," said Mrs. Merdle, delicately crooking the little finger of her favourite hand, and making her remarks neater by that neat action, "cases there are where a man is not young or elegant, and is rich and has a handsome establishment already. Those are of a different kind. In such cases—" Mrs. Merdle shrugged her snowy shoulders and put her hand upon the jewel-stand, checking a little cough as though to add, "Why, a man looks out for this sort of thing, my dear." Then the parrot shrieked again, and she put up a glass to look at him and said, "Bird, do be quiet." "But young men," resumed Mrs. Merdle, "and by young men you know what I mean, my love, I mean people's sons who have the world before them, they must place themselves in a better position towards society by marriage, or society really will not have any patience with their making fools of themselves. Dreadfully worldly all this sounds," said Mrs. Merdle, leaning back in her nest and putting up her glass again. "Does it not?" "But it is true," said Mrs. Gowan with a highly moral air. "My dear, it is not to be disputed for a moment," returned Mrs. Merdle, "because society has made up its mind on the subject, and there is nothing more to be said. If we were in a more primitive state, if we lived under roofs of leaves and kept cows and sheep and creatures instead of bankers' accounts, which would be delicious, my dear, I am pastoral to a degree by nature, well and good. But we don't live under leaves and keep cows and sheep and creatures.